What is neurodiversity?
What is it about these people?
Dyslexia.
Autism spectrum.
ADHD.
Gifted.
Dysgraphia.
All brains are different.
It's okay to be who you are.
This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, your host, and the author of the forthcoming books, Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom from Free Spirit Publishing, and Raising Twice Exceptional Children, a Handbook for Parents of Neurodivergent Gifted Kids from Proofrock Publishing. In addition to being a neurodiversity advocate, I'm also #ActuallyADHD, and I am excited to share today's episode about the importance of giving voice to neurodivergent people. Before we launch into our conversation with the editors of the book, Sincerely Your Autistic Child, I want to thank you for being here and listening to this podcast. If you support our podcast and you know others who support neurodiversity, take a minute and share your favorite episode with them. You can also help us out by leaving a quick review or a rating in your favorite podcast app or following us on social media. We are Neurodiversity Podcast on Facebook and Instagram and @NeurodiversePod on Twitter. Coming up,
my name is Emily Paige Ballou, and I am the co-editor of the anthology Sincerely Your Autistic Child, and also part of the social media team for AWN, and I am also an AEA stage manager.
My name is Morénike Giwa Onaiwu, and I am also a co-editor of Sincerely Your Autistic Child. I am a humanities scholar at Rice University and was formerly a board member of the Autistic Women and Nonbinary Network.
That's in just a minute.
Hi, I'm Dave Morris, the executive producer of this podcast. Putting together something like this is a huge endeavor, from planning and booking guests to putting together the finished product to buying equipment, even traveling to get the stories we present. It's a lot of work. As twice exceptional parents of 3 2E kids, my wife Emily and I wanted to start this podcast so we could share our experiences and help others along the way. So my request is this. If you get some benefit from our podcast, would you consider becoming a Neurodiversity Podcast patron? Just $1 or $2 a month can really add up, and not only would you be helping defray costs, you become eligible for some members-only perks. Listening to our podcast is a free experience, and it always will be. Chipping in will help us continue bringing compelling content to listeners around the world. Go to patreon.com/neurodiversity or go to neurodiversitypodcast.com and click support at the top of the page. And thanks.
Today we're talking with the editors of the book, Sincerely Your Autistic Child. Emily and Morénike, thank you for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I really loved reading the essays that were included in this anthology. Emily, can you tell us a little bit about how this book came about?
The first version of this book actually came into being, believe it or not, about 7 years ago now, when AWN, which was then simply the Autism Women's Network, was putting together an anthology that at the time was aimed primarily at the parents of autistic girls, because even more so a few years ago than now, so much of the professional autism advocacy world was aimed at little boys and at the parents of boys, and professional knowledge about autistic kids assumed that most autistic kids were boys. Mm-hmm. The diagnostic disparity between boys and girls at the time, I think something like 4 boys were being diagnosed for every girl diagnosed. And we're starting to know a lot more about why that might not actually be true. The ratios are probably much closer to equal than we have thought they were in the past. But just a lot of professional knowledge was very biased towards the experience of boys. And so we really wanted to put something out there about the experiences of people who grew up as autistic girls.
And so this is the updated version.
Yes.
And it has a new title and some new essays. Mm-hmm. So Morénike, tell us a little bit about some of the changes and updates with this new volume.
The initial volume was self-published through an imprint that AWN owns, that's Dragon Bee Press, and it has published 2 anthologies to date and done some other work. And so the original editors were Emily Sharon, who is the founder and executive director of AWN, and then Christina, who is a former board member. So over the years, both the research and information about autism and gender and AWN and ourselves, everything has evolved over time. And so though, the book is AWN's baby, it's the very first publication, it became more and more clear that there was going to need to be more information that was more expansive, that addressed not only women and girls, but also other, gender minorities, and just a lot of, just in general that could be utilized by parents. And so there were some transitions occurring at the time. Christina completed her doctorate and was starting a business, and all this stuff was going on. So I was fortunate to be drafted to work alongside Sharon and Emily. And so we all, talked amongst ourselves and with AWN leadership about what we wanted to see. And one thing that was very clear is that we wanted to make sure that we preserved the integrity of the original book, because it was, a very important and groundbreaking book. The people had been selected very carefully, and we had allowed people to share their authentic voices. So we wanted to make sure to invite every contributor that had contributed previously to still be part of the book. And if there was anything that they might want to edit or update, they could do that. Another thing that we wanted was to have some more gender and racial diversity. There was some in the initial book. Of course, there's not just one. In the autistic community, there's just so much geographic and racial and socioeconomic and all kinds of, we're all across the spectrum. So there was some diversity in the initial book, but there have been some changes in some people's way of identifying. And then there are some new individuals who've discovered their diagnosis and entered our community. So we wanted to have, bring on some people who identified as non-binary or transmasculine, and some individuals who were people of color and lived outside of the United States and different age ranges. So we were really, really happy with the people that we invited to join us because we feel like it was a really great complement to the existing contributors. And so we just feel like the new material and the existing material just mesh so well together. And so having the voices of someone who's from Generation Z and, just barely in her 20s, and then someone from the silent generation and everything in between, millennials, exennials, Generation X, and Generation Jones, and people of all kinds of backgrounds, and diagnosed young, diagnosed late. It's just, the book is awesome. And I'm not saying that just because I'm one of the co-editors.
No, I agree. So, I'm a mental health practitioner and work a lot with neurodiverse individuals. And it's only been out like a little over a week. And I mean, I was aware of the previous version, but even with this, I'm already referring parents to it because it's such a good way to help understand what their kids are going through. Mm-hmm. One of the main themes that I feel is so important when parents are working with neurodivergent kids, especially autistic kids, is the idea of presuming competence. To me, what that really means is when parents and educators are supporting neurodivergent kids, we have to operate from the assumption that they can do a task and they want to be successful, but they might need some support or they might need to learn how to do it. I want to talk a little bit more about that, though. Morénike, can you talk a little bit more about that idea of presuming competence?
It's a very important concept in our community, and it's one that I hope will become the norm instead of becoming this thing that's radical. So often people seem to assume the worst. And I don't know if that's because of fear or lack of information or knowledge, but what we are trying to get people to understand is what you are seeing or what you believe that you are seeing on the surface is not indicative of what's going on. You have no idea what the comprehension level of this child is, what the cognitive ability of this child, their interests, their dreams, just because what you see seems to be someone who is unengaged, or by neurotypical standards, you might think that that means lack of understanding, and so forth. That's not necessarily what what is there. When we think about the analogy of an iceberg, there's so much more beneath the surface than what we can see. And so it's important to presume competence, because presuming competence means that you're having expectations for your child that are reasonable and high. You're not assuming the worst. So if you need to adjust those expectations over time, as your child grows, that's fine. But why start at the base level? We don't presume guilty until proven innocent in this country. We presume it's innocent until proven guilty. We don't go to the negative assumption. But when it comes to disability, we do.
Absolutely. A lot of the time when we ask parents to presume the competence of their autistic kids, what people think that means a lot of the time is to assume that every autistic child is a savant or is some kind of secret genius. And that's not really it at all. Of course, savantism does exist in our population, but it really just means to presume that every single person does grow and learn from our environment and has the capacity to grow and learn, even if it's in a very different way than what people are used to seeing. We don't develop on the same timelines, and this is actually one of the things that neurological research is starting to show about autistic people, is that the way that our brains grow and change over time is different from what it is for neurotypical kids in ways that aren't wrong or damaging. It just means that skill acquisition can take a lot more time in certain ways, and there's nothing wrong with that. To support it rather than deny its possibility really opens up the possibility for us to achieve competence. And also that it can be safer to assume that somebody understands more than you think they necessarily might. So it's one of the reasons that we ask parents, for instance, not to say damaging things about autism in front of their autistic children, because your child might not understand anything about what you're saying, but they might understand everything about what you're saying. And so presuming that they might know more than you think they do can really help preserve their self-worth and their sense of their own competence.
I know that, you mentioned some contributors were early diagnosed, some were late diagnosed, but a lot of the writers also talked about their experiences with depression or even being suicidal throughout their lives, sometimes before a diagnosis, other times because their needs weren't understood or supported even after they were diagnosed. Would you say that this is something that's really common? And what should parents look for? How can they support that?
I would say that it is very common. The research on suicidal ideation and autism is still not where it needs to be. This is something that we have a sense as a community is really, really common. And it's one of the most common research topics that we really ask for people to look at more as a community, because the suicide rates are believed to be much higher for autistic people than non-autistic people. But one of the things you run into, for instance, is that even like signs of depression or how we perform on screening tools for depression are often not the same as for neurotypical people. And it can be for a lot of reasons, like that we don't have the same emotional language. We might not have the same kinds of day-to-day experiences as neurotypical people. And so it can be hard to pick up in the same ways, whether or not something like that is going on. One thing I ask parents a lot, especially if they don't understand like why their child is behaving in a certain way, is that if your child's behavior has changed suddenly for the worse, to look at what might be going on that you don't know about, or what possibly happened shortly before that happened, because a lot of things can come out in behavioral changes that we might not be able to express in emotional language. And that can be anything from abuse to something going on at school, to grief, to moving or life disruption or anything like that, can impact us in ways that we might not know how to express in a more typical way.
So there's research, as Emily mentioned, there is a need for improvement. It's still not all the way there yet for a variety of reasons. And there are a lot of things that people don't understand that they miss about us. But some of the research that we do have, a recent study, a nationwide study that came out earlier this year, indicated that the suicide risk in autistic people is probably 3 times higher than that of of people who are non-autistic, and then also determined that women and girls tend to have a higher likelihood of suicidal ideation than other genders. Additionally, it found that the 90% of the people who attempted suicide or had suicidal ideation had some type of other co-occurring, psychiatric disability. And we know that it's, very frequent that many of us have, depression or anxiety or various different neurological and psychological, diagnoses. I think it's interesting because there's the material that we read often states that people who have the DSM-4 diagnoses, so people whose diagnoses are Asperger's or PDD, NOS, have higher rates of suicidal ideation than people who have autistic disorder. There isn't as large of a body of research with DSM-5, but I would venture to say that I think that's wrong too. I think that if someone presents or communicates differently, it may be difficult to understand if they're feeling suicidal. One of the contributors in our book talks about how demoralizing and hurtful it was for people to talk about her as if she wasn't there or as if she didn't understand, and to utilize words like low functioning and operates at X level, child level of ability. And I think that I think about the periods in my own life when I've been suicidal, and what are the warning signs of what, that are supposed to be warning signs of suicide wouldn't have been mine, giving things away and all that kind of stuff. Like some of the things that they state that you're going to do, that might be what others do. That wasn't on my radar in terms of, and so I think that, and we are very, logical, concrete thinkers. So I was nearly successful with each of my attempts. And it was only because I was fooled by someone coming, thank God now. But I think that parents need to be really vigilant in terms of being open with your child long before there's ever a time that they might be depressed or suicidal. You want to establish open communication so that when things start to deteriorate or there are problems, your child feels comfortable talking to you about it, because chances are you might not pick up on it. We mask a lot for survival. And so we might find ourselves unintentionally masking even the signs of our own depression, not to be deceitful, but just because it goes with the territory.
I recently saw a meme that was being shared, and really what it was referring to was the sensory differences for autistic individuals. And it was talking about that pain scale, that 0 to 10 or 1 to 10. And it was like the same facial expression for all of them.
I saw that.
But I feel like that's a good analogy for the mental health things too, because parents will often say, they're telling me that they feel depressed, but I don't see it. I don't see them acting that way. Mm-hmm. But when you really start talking to them and understanding what it is that they're experiencing, it definitely is there beneath the surface, but it just doesn't always, because it's just a different way of communicating some of those things. Mm-hmm. We have to be receptive, I think, to it.
And I've never been suicidal myself, but one of the things I tell people is that there are all of the very overt ways that society speaks badly about autistic people and expresses that we're bad and wrong, but there are also just 100 or 1,000 really, really subtle ways in which things don't work the same for us as they do for other people. And over time, that can just take a huge toll on your sense of your ability to fit in anywhere or belong anywhere. And so I think that might be a factor that, researchers just don't know how to look at. Is it's not just that we hear horrible things said about autistic people all the time, although we do. It's just that in 1,000 really, really subtle ways, the world is less accessible to us.
And in a way that, to add to that, because that's absolutely true, and in a way that's constant.
Yeah.
And, daily. And that is missed by most people. So it's anything from the expectations of how one is supposed to engage in a particular setting, the terminology that is used and the hidden and unspoken things, and the times you reached out for help and nothing really worked for you. You texted a text hotline, they gave you a platitude, you asked back a question, they didn't know what to say, their script doesn't work for you, or you tried to go to a therapist and they didn't really get you or get your circumstances or get autism, or, for a variety of reasons. People miss a lot of our emotions when we're happy or when we're unhappy because they're expecting them to present a particular way. And so I think that it can be that accumulation over time of all of these little messages and microaggressions and hurts of you're nothing, you're nobody, you're broken, and of not being believed when you are harmed, and people that are looked up to by others that are secretly harming us in one way or another in the way that they treat us, talk about us, or what have you, and we aren't believed. The gaslighting also contributes to a lot of this.
One of the things that has been on my mind recently is, you mentioned going to a therapist or a counselor and seeking help. And I'm so hyper aware right now of how many of the models that we use in the mental health field don't fit for neurodivergent people.
Right.
So many things are behaviorally based.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I have an autistic client who comes in and they're talking about feeling bullied at school, and so we're talking through it and trying to figure out, what's going on. And if I'm unaware of how they perceive situations and how they interact with others, and I'm trying to do, use some cognitive behavioral therapy, it does almost turn into a form of gaslighting.
Yeah.
Change your thoughts. You're not thinking about this the correct way. Mm-hmm. And I worry so much about just about neurodivergent people in general who are going and seeking help. And there's such a lack of awareness in the mental health field about what autism, ADHD, like what those things look like in girls or in whatever doesn't fit the typical mold, whatever they are expecting. It's not that.
In fact, a lot of autistic people report having had problems with CBT therapy for that reason exactly. We have built up patterns of experience that non-disabled people and non-autistic people don't experience and don't know how to see. And again, that can be really, really subtle and unrelenting. And that alone can make it hard to talk about or distinguish what is truly different for you.
Mm-hmm. Sadly, though well-intended, I think that there are a number of therapists who have actually messed us up worse. I almost would venture to say that it'd be better to get no therapy than to get bad therapy.
I concur.
Because again, it's just adding to that accumulation of slights and ways that you're not right.
Yep.
And you're, and it can be challenging. I mean, I literally in my entire life, and I was, diagnosed with major depression at the age of 11, 12 when I had my first suicide journal. I have one therapist who I moved back to the state, not because of her, but when I moved back to the state, I looked her up because she is the one person who has ever worked for me in a practical way, solving things and working through things in my head and not just giving me nonsense, or not just letting me vent. And then, because I'm coming here because I want some tangible solutions, even if it takes baby steps to get there. And so fortunately, this is someone that's accustomed to working with, neurodiverse individuals and, youth and adults. And it's been very, very helpful for me. But I think that that's more the exception than the norm.
Yeah.
It's a challenge, especially for me right now, because there are recommendations coming out for people in my professional area that, we even post on the call board what local mental health resources might be in case somebody needs to access them. And I am truly, truly afraid of inadvertently sending somebody into a situation that's going to make it worse.
You mentioned earlier about how this new edition of the book is more inclusive of individuals who are either non-binary or transgender. And some of the writers share about those experiences, identifying as not cisgender. And there's a lot of overlap within the autistic community and the LGBTQ plus community in general. I think that that's something that's many people are unaware of.
Yeah.
What are some of your thoughts about gender identity and gender expression for autistic people?
It's very interesting. I think as a society, we're starting to understand a lot more about sexuality and gender than we did. Like I think about when I was young, there was gay, straight, and bi.
Yep.
And gay could be, lesbian, or a male. That's it. That's all there was. Oh, I'm sorry. And then there was what we called transsexual. It wasn't called transgender for, a number of years. Now we've evolved. We understand a lot more. But I think that there's a lack of understanding about the way gender and sexuality differs in not only autistic people, but I think in neurodiverse people in general, because of the fact that there's been this sense of infantilization and only wanting to focus on children. And when people have teens thinking that they're not ready for this or that, and institutionalization and the how that takes away people's autonomy definitely plays a role in in a lot of things. But I think that I would venture to say that particularly the older one gets, even the straight autistic people aren't straight like cisgender neurotypical people. It's cisgender or heterosexual, neurotypical. It's just very different. Like I think our perception of gender and our expression of gender, and then and then sex and romance and all of those things, it's so not linear. It's a very, very convoluted way of being, and I think that a lot of people, it's when we develop more understanding is when we start understanding this aspect of our gender and our sexuality. I think a lot of us, don't understand that the people don't think and experience things the way that we do until we start realizing otherwise. So with sensory things, we might know, oh, other people can't hear the buzzing of this fluorescent light, even though it's giving me a headache. We learn fairly early on that other people can put on this pair of socks and it doesn't feel like it's cutting their toe. But with other things, with gender, you just assume that it's, a role everybody's playing, and so it takes a while, but, those aren't the types of really conversations really that you have with people that, you're given a name and you're given a gender or a sex and all of this, and you just kind of go with it until you realize that it doesn't fit. And so I think thinking that it doesn't fit for everybody else either, but that's just what it's called. Like, for example, we call this planet Earth. Why isn't it called, Thulcandra, like in some of C.S. Lewis's books? You know what I mean? That's the name of it. It's not really, doesn't have any traits associated with it. It's just a term. When we start to realize, oh, to be this in this society means this, 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 and this, which does not apply to me. That's when you realize, oh, I may appear like this or I may be called this, but this isn't me. And I think that we're starting to speak out more and not allow those things to be hidden or pathologized. I think that the analogy of coming out of the closet for our community is not just with sexuality, but it's with gender, it's with neurology, it's with a number of things. And even in the book, there's contributors from the original, book whose gender and sexuality has evolved. Well, actually, it isn't that it has evolved; it's that they've become aware of themselves, whereas before they weren't.
Yeah.
You might or might not be aware. I think people in general aren't, but some pretty preliminary research on the topic tends to show that about 70% of autistic people identify as not straight or straightforwardly cisgender. And there's sometimes a tendency for people to say that it's just because we're more honest or we're less bound by social convention or social expectations. And I'm actually not real convinced that that is the case. Because just for instance, one aspect of autism that is, I think is really under-recognized as a central aspect of autism is how we move and how we perceive movement. And that's also a huge aspect of how we express and how we perceive gender in ourselves and others. And there are just all of these, layers which in and of themselves, again, can be really subtle, but the way that they add up can be really immense. As far as, again, sensory experiences and just how we move and how we speak in relation to others in the world, that I think can impact our sense of gender in ourselves. And I'm not convinced that we have a good enough understanding of how gender develops and what it is, even in non-disabled people to have a really good idea of why it can be so different for autistic people. Mm-hmm. So like some non-autistic people feel that gender is something that's very innate to them, and some people are agender and feel that gender is entirely a social construct that's, imposed upon us but isn't innate to us at all. So with that kind of diversity, even in the non-autistic population, I'm not sure we have a really good handle yet on why autistic people seem to experience gender development differently at such a high rate.
I was going to add, it's a funny story now, but it wasn't funny for us then. When the AWN changing the name from Autism Women's Network to Autistic Women and Nonbinary Network was a long time coming, because even when Autism Women's Network was found, at that time it was radical to be saying, why are you focusing only on women and girls when it's all these boys? It was seen as being, this discriminatory group instead of that we're meeting a need. But AWN had always been, an inclusive community. And so even though it wasn't in the name, there were always individuals who were non-binary, agender, transgender, et cetera, who were part of AWN always. And so when the name changed, it was very interesting. We announced kind of our explanation of and rationale for doing so, and the name was formally changed. And Emily heads the social media team for, and has done so for a long time for AWN. And it was mind-blowing, the amount of attacks that we got from people. How could you do this? People already don't care enough about women, and now this, and I'm not following your page anymore. My child's 4. I don't want to hear about this sex stuff. And I'm thinking, wow, people really, really converge all of this stuff. Like, gender and sexuality are different. They can be intertwined, but this is not even what we're talking about. People get so riled up and confused and by terms, and so that they're not even really understanding what we're trying to express here and what we're trying to let them be cognizant of. And your child's not always going to be 4, and even your 4-year-old might already be experiencing life. Is different than a 4-year-old whose neurology is different than theirs. And so we found that it's just we're just hoping that people will grow over time and understand, because this is about the reality of what is. It's not about how it feels or whether it's good or bad or neutral. Some things just are. Like, we exhale carbon dioxide. That's not a good thing or a bad thing. A plant thinks it's a good thing. But for us, it's just something that we do. And it is a fact, and Emily mentioned there's research, and yes, we know some of it's still preliminary, but even some huge longitudinal large-scale studies have shown, up to 3 to 6%, times more, up to 70%, depending on which data set you're looking at, that this is a reality. Our perception and expression of gender does vary. How it varies exactly differs. Temple Grandin considers herself asexual, but a cisgender heterosexual female. Does she present in the way a typical cisgender heterosexual female who's not autistic presents? I'd venture to say no. So it's variable.
Mm-hmm. We did take a lot of outrage when we made the name change, but I also just want to say that I was also overwhelmed by how much gratitude and how much thankfulness we actually got from our community for that, too.
Yes.
Before the name change, our position had always been that we were there for anybody who identified as a woman now or in the present or in the past in any way whatsoever. And so that left a lot of latitude for people who realized that they were transgender later in life, or people who realized they had, other gender experiences later in life. But I would also say that as valid as any gender identity, like to be non-binary or trans or agender, those are all totally identities that exist in both autistic and non-autistic people. But also, just as I heard somebody put it before, there are a lot of ways to be a woman, and there are a lot of ways to be a man. And I think sometimes we act as if non-disabled people have a monopoly on what those right ways are, and they don't. And this is a conversation also in other disability communities, that when you move in different ways because of any disability, it impacts others' perceptions of your gender. If disability means that you're a man or a woman in a way that is different from non-disabled convention, that's still a valid way.
So one last question before we wrap up. The book was framed as an opportunity for autistic individuals writing to their parents. If that were reversed and you could give young autistic individuals a few words of wisdom, what would you want them to hear?
It's interesting. There was a Flash blog some years ago where, in a short period of time, a lot of people provided writing contributions, and it was all compiled into, a blog that was for a particular purpose. And I think it was in response to someone was looking for something, and they found, basically they were typing a search term in Google, and what came up was something like, I can't remember, was like, I am autistic and I'm broken, or I don't know if you remember, Emily, it's been too long.
Somebody in their blog settings had found that a Google search result that had led somebody to their blog was just, I don't want to be autistic anymore, or something like that.
And it was heartbreaking. And so, there have been a number of different initiatives by various different individuals and groups in the community to try to, talk to, I think about, and I know that there's criticism, and I won't say that some of it's not valid, of the It Gets Better campaign, although I do think that youth, whoever the youth are, it's beneficial to be able to understand and relate to the experiences of people who've been where you are and are somewhere else, even if your life is not going to be the same. So even though I know that sometimes people feel like it's a little too Pollyanna-ish for, our queer youth, I think that there is a lot of value in being able to look at someone and see yourself in them, or see experiences similar to yours, or see that they can, and so I feel like for me, I tell parents one thing because of their role. A parent has so many roles in the life of a child. You're a confidant, you're, a guardian, you're a friend, you're this and that. But for the child, really, I hope that they come to find that who you are is okay. Like it's okay being you. If you never get different or better than what you are right now, what you are is fine. Because I feel like this mentality that people have is you've got to overcome and become some kind of success story according to whatever standards of whether it's societal, whether it's your own, your family's, and we can all aspire to grow and change, but how that looks is not going to be identical. And so I really just want you, it doesn't matter if you are an AAC user, if you or not. It doesn't matter if you're considered quote unquote high functioning or quote unquote low functioning, which are inaccurate terms anyway. I think what I really just want that sense of self-acceptance and self-love, and that you're enough and that you matter and you deserve. I think that it may sound simple, but I think it's a very difficult concept for most of us when you live in a world that tells you every moment of every day that that's not the case. And so I feel like what if one could get a jump start on that and instill that way of thinking in our youth, it won't shield them from the things that they're still going to experience in terms of ableism, but it gives you a sense of grounding in terms of who you are.
Our lives definitely can be harder, and I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but that doesn't mean that they can't be rewarding and worthwhile. And what I wrote in the book to parents, in one of the concluding chapters, is basically just that there is a place for your child in the world. And I would also say that to any autistic person. No matter, again, how hard it can be to believe in the moment, and it can still be hard for me to believe in the moment, but that there actually is a place for you in the world. I believe that there is a niche for everybody in this world where they can do what they are meant to be doing.
Morénike and Emily, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For too long, neurodivergent people have been spoken over and ignored. The neurodiversity movement is working to change that, to help autistic and neurodivergent people self-advocate. Whether we're discussing racial diversity or neurodiversity, having people share from their own experiences is an opportunity to learn and understand how to best support them, and in turn, make the world a more supportive place for all neurodivergent people. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
We'd like to thank our guests, Emily Paige Ballou and Morénike Giwa Onaiwu. If you'd like to know more about the Autistic Women and Nonbinary Network, you can go to awnnetwork.org. We have links to the book on the episode 84 page at neurodiversitypodcast.com. We love suggestions, so if you know of someone who would make a great guest, go to the contact page of our website and drop us a note. Again, it's neurodiversitypodcast.com. I'm Dave Morris, the executive producer of this podcast, and for Emily and the rest of our staff, we don't have a staff. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a production of Morris Creative Services.